The subject of this interview is Mr. Howie Kaibel, and today's date is 1/20/2012. This interview is being conducted at the Neighborhood House in St. Paul, Minnesota, and is part of the Civic Voices International Democracy Memory Bank project. Mr. Kaibel, would you please affirm that you have signed the deed of gift authorizing Memory Bank project to make this interview available to future researchers?
I did.
Thank you. Now we will begin with our first question. Would you tell me about where you grew up?
I grew up in Minnesota, mostly in Roseville. And then we moved to Duluth for a year, and I moved back to high school in Hopkins.
Which neighborhood would you like to walk us through?
Which neighborhood would you like to walk us through? Well, I spent really my adult life near Lake Harriet in South Minneapolis, and that would be my neighborhood.
Where did you go to college?
University of Minnesota.
What was that like?
Oh, it was wonderful. I think that's where I learned everything. I would encourage you to make. You'll find it's an entirely different world.
What initially inspired you to become a lawyer?
I used to like Perry Mason on TV. And then I went to the high school careers class, and a local Judge Vesely came to and told us that you're never really in court. You spend all of your 9 out of 10 of your cases are going to settle out of court, so don't think that you're going to be like Perry Mason, and so then it had less appeal to me. And but when I had an undergraduate degree in political science and history, there really wasn't anything I could do with it, so I decided to go to law school then.
Would you consider yourself an activist?
I certainly was an activist back then, yes.
So we gathered information that you're a public defender, and for many clients involved in the 1968 protests for the Democratic National Convention, did you ask for those particular cases, or was that coincidental?
No, that's a mistake. I was a delegate to the 1968 Democratic Convention.
Okay.
And although I knew a lot of the kids who were young people who were beaten up, and it was a terrible time.
Yeah. Did you hear about the racial equality? Like, what intrigued you about that whole time?
I was active. It was a wonderful time. I mean, all you read in the newspaper every day, people today don't realize that there was a time when people of color couldn't eat in the same restaurants or lunch counters, couldn't use the same restrooms. They couldn't drink at the same drinking fountains, couldn't even swim in a municipal swimming pool, and people treated it as if it were just to be expected. That's the way it always was. And what the civil rights movement, I think, did was to say, no, it doesn't have to be that way, and you can change it, and you just have to, and you can do it nonviolently. You can, to take up arms, or even, I think, for the most part, call in troops. And it could be done in Congress, too. So it was a time when we realized that you can really bring about change and do it. All you have to do is all get together and do it.
You said you were friends with a lot of the kids that were beaten up and abused. How did that affect your personality and your life at that time?
Oh, I was a delegate in the same hotel as the Gene McCarthy headquarters was, and a Hilton Hotel, I think it was. And on the last day of the convention, the Chicago police came up and dragged all of the young people who were on the 17th floor, all the way down, bouncing on down the stairs. It was so it was a time when it was bad enough to have lost the endorsement at the convention, and then to they had a commission, a Kerner commission, I think it was, that a blue ribbon bipartisan commission that looked into what happened, and it published a report that said it was a police riot, and I think that's what happened really at the 1968 convention.
Did the segregation of everything around you affect you and your family? Were you aware of, what time were you aware that that wasn't really okay?
Well, of course, I grew up in the North, so there wasn't that kind of segregation here at all. You read about it in the newspaper and such. But it was a time when we had a group called Students for Integration, and we organized to support the civil rights workers that went down south, and then eventually I did go down there myself for a summer. And there were other things that were happening on campus. So I was president of a religious foundation, and all the religious foundations at the university got together and something called a Council of Student Religious Organizations, and they agreed to send somebody to Washington for a big convention on religion and race to try and get the Civil Rights Bill passed. And I was fortunate enough to be the one they said, I think it's the first time I ever rode on an airplane. And to go to Washington, D.C. was just a dream. And on top of it, coincidentally, the first day, I'm just wandering around in awe in the Senate office building, and who should I meet but Hubert Humphrey, who had always been the ideal in politics. And you don't want to get into that story, but it was a wonderful. Anyway, and it turned out that Hubert was going to be the big speaker for the convention, and of course, the Civil Rights Bill passed. And even though they said you'd never get that by the filibuster and all that stuff, it did, and it worked, and I think it taught us all that democratic institutions will work if you just put your mind to it. And that's kind of what we did with the anti-war movement, which was kind of coincident with that. It first got me into politics in 1966. Was Keith Rolvag. Governor Rolvag was challenged by his lieutenant governor, Sandy Keith. We don't need to get into all of that, but that's the first time I ever went to political caucuses, and we could go on for a long time.
Could you talk a little bit more about the group that just sent you to Washington, D.C.? What was that? Explain that a little bit.
Well, that was just all the there were religious foundations, the Catholic Newman Club, each denomination and religion had, usually they had places where you could meet. Mine was the Student Religious Liberals, and we met up above the Big Ten bar. We rented a room, but all the religious organizations each sent one representative to the Council of Student Religious Organizations. And they got very active, as you can imagine, in supporting the civil rights movement.
Could you explain what was going through your head when you first walked into that building and it was just like, what happened?
It was just hard to believe that I was really in the seat of power of the free world, and here I was, where all the good things happened, and then I run into Hubert. Oh my!
What part of the anti-war movement inspired you to take action?
Well, one of the guys who really deserves all the credit and gets, although they did do a Time magazine article on him, was Al Lowenstein. And he was a past president of the National Student Association, and that's where I first met him, was at a National Student Association Congress. And then I could tell you 1,000 stories about Al, but the basic thing that happened in the anti-war, because we did pass a very strong resolution against the Vietnam War at the National Student Congress. And there was a big debate. He debated David Harris, I think was his name, who was one of those people in California that they were lying down in front of troop trains as a protest to the war. And Al's point in the debate was, that's not the way to change this. What we've got to do is change public opinion on the war, and we've got to organize and do that, and it's not an easy task. At that time, 20% of the people were against the war, and 80% were in favor of it, and we set out for that following year I wrote along with 100 other student body presidents, we had a student body president's letter against the war that we sent to the New York Times and got printed, and Al was at the same time coordinating the same kind of effort by the returned Peace Corps volunteers, the Rhodes Scholars, the businessmen against the war. I took around a lawyers against the war ad, and I was really surprised to see that all these famous lawyers were not only willing to put their names on an ad against the war, but they were willing to suggest other lawyers who I should go and talk to, and they were willing to contribute to pay for the ad, and that same sort of thing was happening all over, and it generated meetings because our 100 student body presidents, then there was another letter by 200 more student body presidents, and we got a chance to meet with Dean Rusk and McGeorge Bundy, and the long part of it is that when we met with McGeorge Bundy, I think they got some kind of a Ford Foundation grant for 20 of the student body presidents to go and meet with. He was the president's chief advisor at the time. And it was Al who really planted the question, but it finally got a chance to say, Mr. Bundy, we've been doing all of this. We've changed public opinion. Now it's 80% against the war and only 20% in favor of it. Why doesn't the administration move in the direction of negotiating some kind of peace here? We've made it possible for you to move in that peace direction. And he said, looked straight in the eye and said, I just got done talking with the president, and he said, as I left, will you get those damn intellectuals to stop eating my donkey? And that's when we realized, and I did have a meeting. Hubert Humphrey was then vice president, and he met with student body presidents when we came to Washington, and I got a separate meeting with him, and I found the same thing. I thought maybe if you got him alone, he would express some kind of reservations, but he didn't. It was terrible. We realized, that was about the time we got to the next student congress in August of '67, and we said, okay, Al, we did it your way. We've changed public opinion. We've done all this work, and it's not working. Now what do we got to do? And he said, well, obviously the Republicans aren't going to help on it, so we've got to find somebody to run against L.B.J. within the Democratic Party, which seemed to us to be just incredible. but we set out to do that, and after we organized at first it was the dissenting Democrats, and it was just a handful of people in a living room, but we gradually expanded, and Al came out and spoke at the Universalist Church, and we changed our name from dissenting Democrats to concerned Democrats, so that we weren't the dissenters out there, we were the real Democrats. Well, you know the rest of the story. Much to our surprise, we found somebody that was willing to run against L.B.J., and he happened to be a senator from Minnesota, so and then we won the primary in New Hampshire. I think we came up about 200 votes short of beating L.B.J., but we won like 20 out of 24 National Convention delegates because we had them running in the right districts or whatever, but it was clear that he was going to lose the Wisconsin primary next. Oh, and that's when Al and Paul Newman came to the campus. That's another story. But then the president withdrew and said he wasn't going to run it. So that was the good part. There were lots of good things and bad things that year.
Going back to Al's ideas, do you think, why do you think that public opinion changing has a bigger effect than taking extreme actions like laying in front of troop? Yeah.
Well, I think Al's point was that part of the reason why we were the 20%, people viewed war protesters as being out of the mainstream, and not people who are out to lunch laying down in front of trains, instead of normal, real neighbors, doctors, lawyers, businessmen. And I think that's how you had to change the public opinion, because it really worked. Again, just like the civil rights movement, the democratic system does work if decent people get together and put their mind to it.
What did you accomplish through your activism, do you think? Your personal activism.
In personal, what did we accomplish? I mean, we obviously accomplished what we set out to do with civil rights, and we accomplished what we did in changing and stopping the president. Of course, out of that we got Richard Nixon and another 6 years of war, I think. So we couldn't feel that great about the accomplishment.
Yeah. How would you, you said you accomplished everything you tried to, but how do you measure your success and your civic engagement? Is there things you would have done differently, or if you could go back?
Not really very much. Um, I don't know how you would measure success under those circumstances. A lot of personal satisfaction. And I should, I am coming up short. Part of organizing against the war, we took over the political caucuses here in Minnesota. And Hubert Humphrey was vice president, and this was his backyard. But we went door to door, identified the people who were going to, and people were willing to talk to you about it. And we identified the people who were willing to go to the caucuses against the war, and we organized all the precincts. I was a board chairman in the 6th Ward at the time, in downtown Minneapolis. And we had 1,000 people in our ward convention in the Nicollet Hotel ballroom. And we had in each precinct a little blue slate, let the people decide with the names of all the delegates and alternates, and we organized carpools to get everybody to the caucuses, and we gave them classes in what to expect, and we won overwhelmingly, not just in the 6th Ward, but in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th congressional districts. That would be Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the suburbs. And, of course, on the Iron Range and a few other places. Anyway, it worked, and it showed that the political system did work. And I suppose that's how I would gauge the success, because after the National Convention, we had the work to do to come back and run the Democratic Party in Minnesota and do the day-to-day work of electing legislators and city councilmen and city coordinator and mayors and go to law school at the same time.
So you're happy with the outcome of your work?
I think the world is a better place because of it. You can say that just about even the Arab Spring that's going on right now.
Looking back on your engagement with the protesters in 1968, what principles would you say you were fighting for?
Protesters in 68. Well, I was not immune from being a protester, too. When they bombed Cambodia, we set up a protest around the clock at the federal building downtown, and we were all engaged in protesting at one sort or another. We had the student peace union marches against the war and those sorts of things. What was the question?
What principles would you say you were fighting for?
Oh, well, it was a great time on campus. There were at least half a dozen different student organizations, all of which had largely the same kind of people in them. There were the Young Democrats, the Campus Americans for Democratic Action, the Student Religious Liberals, SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, Student Peace Union, Students for Integration, and they did all those kinds of organizing. Excuse me.
So, your student years were your most active years as a activist?
Well, I was just lucky to be at the right place at the right time. And those those were years when where things like civil rights and anti-war were going on. And I was on the supervisory board of the National Student Association when we discovered that the Central Intelligence Agency had infiltrated NSA and actually been involved in influencing the elections, and they weren't supposed to be involved in subverting democratic institutions, and that was certainly an awakening that I guess we learned during that period too, that you can't trust the government. Anybody who thinks it was a single bullet that assassinated President Kennedy is out to lunch. But, you know, I was here when it was Dwight Eisenhower who first lied to us and said that, that spy plane that went down in the Soviet Union, that wasn't ours. We weren't spying. You learned that even father figures like that were willing to lie to you. But, you know, you get to the point where you say, you can't say don't trust anyone, because where do you go from there? And we did trust each other to... One of the things that happened was during the organizing for Gene McCarthy and Al Lowenstein. Well, of course, first of all, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and then Al, who really was not trusted as much anymore by the Gene McCarthy people because he had always been close to Bobby Kennedy, he decided the best thing to do was not to get involved in either of that and just run for Congress in Long Island. And he had to run, first of all, he had to run against the Democratic machine in New York, and in order to get the Democratic nomination, and then he had to run in a district that was overwhelmingly Republican. And just like Al, you know, he'd call me throughout this whole period, he'd call me at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and say, "How you get out of bed? Get a pen, write this down so that you'll remember it in the morning," and then he'd give me my assignment. And I got one of those calls, and it was, "Howie, I need you to come and knock doors for me in Long Island. I'll pay your plane ticket, and I'll make sure that you don't starve, and we'll get you someplace to sleep, and you just knock doors for me for a week, will you please?" So I went out there, but it's a wonderful experience to go door to door with a big bag of literature and be invited into somebody's living room and sit down and tell them why you think Al walks on water and why he ought to be elected to Congress. And they talked to their neighbors, and he won overwhelmingly for Congress. And I think, I was just one of, Al had people like that all over the country, especially the anti-war leaders, and there were a whole lot of people gave up a week or 10 days to go and knock doors for him. And it does, what you learn in this whole process is it does work. People are reasonable. They will listen to what you have to say, and if you just get out there and do a little organizing.
Would you say that you're proud of the many accomplishments you've had, and you're proud of the people that you were involved with?
Oh, yes. Very.
What advice would you give to people that would like to be more civically engaged?
It's funny. I was just yesterday giving some advice to another old retired guy who's a Republican, as to how he should get involved in politics. We've got caucuses coming up in February 7. And he said, well, how do you do that, Howie? I said, you just go that night, and there'll be a convener, and they will say, well, we've got 20 delegates slots here that we got to fill, and there probably won't be 20 people in the room. Jim, you just go. And that's the advice I would give. You know, when we were organizing for the caucuses, and Al and I actually went up, come to think of it, to North Dakota too, and organized in Fargo. You have to tell people to anticipate a couple. For example, anticipate that they're going to say you're a student, you shouldn't be caucusing here. Everybody knows you live out someplace else in Minnesota, and you have to tell them, look, if we went back to where we live in someplace else, they would say, well, you're 9 months of the year you're down there and on the campus, that's where you really live. And then you come here and you say, well, you really live someplace where people without a caucus. You just got to anticipate that and then say, let's take a vote on it, and as long as you've got 50% plus one, you're going to win. And the same thing, those were the kinds of, we talked about what you have to do, and those were times when there were really battles and there were really more people at a caucus than you got spots to fill. But nowadays, there's no reason why you, as soon as you're 18, and it's not 18 now in February, it's 18 by the date of the next election. So the advice to you is advice to the same old duffer yesterday. You just got to go and get involved and learn who's running, and if you're idealistic about something, pass a resolution.
Is there anything else you would like to add before we finish up?
No, nothing in particular, I guess.
All right, well, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you very much for this effort.